All right, guys, welcome back to another edition of our IB 20th Century Show, hosted by just me and not Mr. Slater, because my internet is inhospitable to Zoom and basically any video sharing service. It's very frustrating. So I'm just going to tackle these Cuba slides today. Um, just a quick recap of where we were at when we left off last. We know that Fidel and his insurrectionists were sent to prison following their failed Moncada barrack attack. So he's going to be there shorter than expected. And towards the end of spring in 1955, shortly after a presidential victory, Batista is going to decide, you know what, I'm not threatened by any of these insurrectionists anymore. I have a firm grip on Cuba. I'm just going to go ahead and let them be released. So that's where this first photo takes us here. This is not a great photo because you have that watermark, but it is kind of a cool photo. This is Fidel leaving in 1955 the courthouse after he has officially been released from prison. So I included some photos in this week's lecture just because, I guess as the old cliche says, picture's worth 1,000 words. So I always enjoy the photographs that kind of parallel the historical events that we're talking about. So here's Fidel prior to the beard, and I'm actually going to get into the beard a little bit later in these lectures. The beard obviously is iconic with Fidel, but it actually became symbolic even more so than it was iconic. So here's Fidel leaving in May of 55. So he was released from the Isle of Pines. He solicits the help of Che Guevara and Jose Marti. So Che, you might recognize from, his portrait is one of the most famous, at least in it's kind of become like a pop culture icon. You'll see it on T-shirts sometimes, but he was another extremely influential, basically kind of left-wing organizer, disruptor in South American politics throughout the 20th century. And just as he had planned in prison, Castro decides that he is going to leave Cuba after being released from prison, and then return to basically overthrow this dictatorial regime. So those who were left over from the Moncada barracks, as well as people who were basically disaffected with Batista, he organized them into Cuba. And then realized he had a decent amount of men, but didn't have enough money or anywhere near enough weapons. So he needed to figure out a way to raise a lot of money. And so the way that he did this was actually by going to the United States. There were a lot of ex-Cubans in the United States that at the time were extremely, they were friendly towards Castro, and they were sympathetic towards his mission and his ideals. So he went to Mexico, and then from Mexico went to the United States. Now, he mainly focused on, I'm just making sure I'm on the right side here. He mainly focused on the East Coast, and there were these, what they ended up being called were patriotic clubs in the East Coast, where he would give speeches and he would kind of outline what his platform was, what his vision was for Cuba. And ex-Cubans and Americans who were just basically sympathetic to Castro, they would donate money. And by the time he returned back to Cuba, he had about $50,000 in cash and pledges, and even more so that would be continued to be funneled into Castro to Mexico before he would go back to Cuba. So he was, one of the characteristics we have of our authoritarians is kind of their cult of personality and their charisma. And Castro certainly wasn't lacking in the sense. So he was very captivating as an orator. And so he was able to kind of convince a lot of people and persuade people to believe in his cause. This is a key aspect of what he wanted to do. So this is a great picture. This is Castro walking through Central Park, cigar in hand. Nice suit here. I love this picture. Here he is, chillaxing. Here's Castro chilling. This is again in New York City. I guess this was in between two speeches that he gave in the winter of 1955. So pretty great pictures here. So he comes back to Mexico in 1956. And, if you recall, prior to him organizing the Moncada Barrack attacks, right after graduating from law school, he was initially associated with Eddie Chivas and the Ortodoxo Party. And so he kind of had this political affiliation that he had to officially distance himself from because he was no longer like a politician, he was a revolutionary. And so a revolutionary in a lot of ways is like a politician, except they typically utilize force outside the means of law because he wants to overthrow the government, and that's not what political parties do. So he was an independent movement dedicated to the overthrow of Batista, and the M26-7. That's basically what they're calling themselves, the revolutionaries. This should be familiar to you, but this is the 26th of July movement. Okay, so that's a Spanish translation to the 26th of July movement. And so it's just another example, and we can kind of see the parallels perhaps between, Hitler's beer hall putsch and this, where something on the face value was a failure, but then down the road ends up being kind of symbolic of what the movement represents. So it becomes like this symbolism, this propaganda piece. So he is getting ready in 1956 to kind of fulfill what he is, the prophecy that he has laid out himself, which is that he will come back to Cuba and free them from the Batista regime. So I don't know if this video blocks some of this for you guys, so I'll try and move it around. So insurrectionists, these are people who are training. They're basically military or paramilitary soldiers who want to overthrow the government. It's just a fancy word for it. So he's got training, he's got cash, and now he buys a boat, which is going to take 81 members of M26 towards Cuba. Now, the Grandma is the name of the boat. It's probably Granma, not like I love my grandma. So that's just my horrible pronunciation coming into action there. But the boat, it ends up being kind of another larger symbol within the movement. And in fact, throughout this revolutionary period, which is going to be now until January of 1959, Castro and his followers, they're actually going to start a publication, which is, a communist rag, where they are going to outline kind of what their beliefs are, what their plans are, how they've outsmarted the military, all so on and so forth. And it ends up being called the Daily Granma. So this ship, even though it's a total failure, and I'll get to that, it just becomes another example of something that is kind of a symbol that Castro uses to his advantage. So we've got 81 members. They hoped that the trip would take about 6 days, and they would arrive, again, this is 1956, on November 30th. And they wanted their arrival to coincide with an uprising that was planned by individuals who were already in Cuba. So I'm not trying to get us too in the weeds here, but the individual that was already in Cuba that was supposed to lead this was a man by the name of Frank Pais. So basically, long story short, here's the plan. Frank Pais is in Cuba, okay? In the days leading up to November 30th, he would stage an island-wide uprising. So everybody would be going crazy. While that's happening, Castro's boat would be able to kind of descend into Cuba undetected because of all the commotion going on, and then the overthrow would be underway. However, this does not go according to plan for a variety of reasons. Okay, here's Frank. He looks like a nice guy. Okay, so a couple of problems. Most of the men became very seasick. It's not a bore, it's a boat. Sorry, because the Granma was a horrible boat, not a bore. It had a lot of failures. They also horrifically overpacked the boat, so it was way, 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 way too heavy. And I don't really understand boats very well, but obviously I can't even spell it. But it did not navigate the seas well at all. So you had all these took too long. You had mechanical failures. Members of M26-7 were violently sick, and because of all this, it took way too long. So Frank had no idea that this was taking this long. And so he went forward with the planned upheaval on the island, but Castro wasn't there at the same time, so they couldn't coordinate together, and it was a failure. This is a picture of members of the rebellion actually getting onto the Granma. So this was taken in Mexico. I tried to find some good pictures. This is probably the best picture I could find. I know it's not ideal, but this is them actually getting on the ship. So, like I said, Pais, unaware of Castro's delay, he began his attack as scheduled. Pais started the operation with 86 armed men, and again, very similar to what we're going to be seeing throughout these type of attacks. He had hoped for the element of surprise. However, and kind of like we saw with the Moncada barracks, they lost it immediately. Somebody had failed. One of his men got captured, and then they were basically attacking another military installation, and then a bunch of Batista's men barricaded themselves in the headquarters, and then called for air support. So there was no way that rebels were going to be able to deal with air support, so they had to withdraw. However, they were able to get some arms, ammunition, and again, that's their main goal when they're attacking these military installations. Although, and I said this last time, but it's worth repeating, although bloodshed is inevitable, it's going to happen when you have people fighting with guns, and that's obvious. Their goal isn't to necessarily inflict the human death. The death toll isn't their main purpose. Their purpose is to gather arms and ammunition, because then they can arm people who are part of their movement, and it gives them more power, because it gives them the potential to damage more. And the more potential you have to inflict damage upon a country, the more legitimate you are forced to be seen by the current government in charge. So at this time, they estimate, we don't really know for sure, it's hard to know because it was a lot of peasants and there wasn't like a census, but it was estimated around 2,000 members in M26-7. Now, again, no cell phones, they weren't radioing back and forth between each other. So Pais was unaware of Castro's struggles. Castro was unaware of Pais's struggles. And remember, Castro was supposed to initially get there on November 30th. He doesn't actually get there until December 2nd, 1956. So he's at least a couple of days late. And as I said earlier, the ship was completely overloaded with supplies. They had to beach the ship. They beached it in a place where there was very swampy and it was difficult to navigate. And they were spotted almost immediately by Batista patrols, who immediately started firing upon all the people trying to get off of the ship. 3 people died. They had to abandon a lot of their supplies on the ship, and they basically all immediately had to split up and go into the forest and go into the Sierra Maestra Mountains, which is where the majority of this story ends up taking place. Okay, so this is a total disaster. If you can imagine going on the worst, if you've ever been seasick, being seasick is a horrific experience. It really is. It's incredibly disorienting. And so you do that. It takes longer than normal, and then as soon as you get off, you got to get off in a swamp, and then you're being fired at. So it's a pretty negative situation. Okay, so I wanted to paint the picture here. I think context is important too. So Cuba, in this part of Cuba, it's the Oriente province. Okay, so this is the southern end of Cuba. It is very mountainous. Okay, so this is an actual picture of the Sierra Maestra Mountains. It's serious. It is rough terrain, and it's jungle terrain. Okay, so if you were competent at navigating this area, you could do a good job at hiding from anybody that's looking for you. And so this is where the majority of the rebels end up spending their time, and they're constantly moving. This is another extremely important part, is that they are constantly moving through these mountains. And it just ends up being so embarrassing to Batista because he can't find them. And that ends up being for basically 2 reasons. Number 1, Castro knew the mountains very well. And number 2, the peasants liked Castro and they hated Batista. So they always knew where the army was at all times. Castro always knew where the army was. So not only did he know where they were, but the peasants would, when the army would ask if they'd seen Castro, they would almost always tell them that they went in the opposite direction that they actually went. So the army, they didn't really have a chance. And Castro is going to embarrass Batista at a couple different turns here that we're going to get to. So this is actually, Castro's first hideout. So after they get cornered by the troops when they get off the Granma in December of 1956, this is their first camp, and they actually stay here a bit longer than a lot of the other ones. And this is, to this day, a national park in Cuba. So that's why we have this wonderful color photograph here, because you can actually still visit this enclosure today. It's a national park, and you can see where the rebels originally hid out. So this is a picture from December of 56 of Castro reading a newspaper. As you can see, the beard has just barely started, but it is not going to get to its peak length. Now, well, I'll say that for the next. You guys have something to look forward to. We'll have beard discussion on the next one. This is a picture that ends up being run in the New York Times. Okay, so I'm going to get to this Herbert Matthews interview here in a second. But this is a younger Castro here. This ends up being in February of 57. But another famous photo here. So let's get back to the story here. Enough photo time. So he ends up being cornered on December 5th, Castro, and he tells his soldiers to split into groups of 3, so very, very small numbers. And then he tells them all a specific spot in the mountains that they're all going to reconvene. So the story goes that Fidel's group was actually forced to be like lying prone, which is like completely flat on your stomach, without food or water for 5 days in a cane field. They survived off eating roots. And because the soldiers didn't find anyone, Batista just assumed, and this was a horrible tactical mistake, he just assumed that Castro was killed, and then decided to leak to the press that they had killed Castro and his revolutionaries, that they were killed and arrested. And so this is obviously, because it wasn't true, this is going to make Batista look silly, weak, stupid, wrong, whatever adjective you want to come up with. So on Christmas Eve, Raul, Fidel's brother, Che, the guy I was talking about earlier, and then 11 survivors, so only 11 left from the Granma expedition. They assemble at a point, the highest point of the Sierra Maestra range, Pico Turcaino. I'm sure I'm saying that incorrectly, so I apologize. But they needed a Christmas miracle. They didn't have food, they didn't have weapons, they didn't have ammo. Almost everything had been lost that they had planned for. So their only hope was to basically restart, come up with a new plan, and basically rehabilitate and occupy the mountain, live on the mountain, become mountain peasants while they figure out a plan. So Castro remained unshaken, even though these times were obviously so tumultuous. So they end up engaging in a few, they get some arms and some ammunition from some rebels that they borrow, and they attack a few kind of rural outposts of the military, and they're able to get some weapons back. They're starting to grow their followers. Peasants decide to join them. And on January 16th, they attack a small army outpost at La Plata, and they have a tremendous amount of success attacking these outposts in a very specific way that he's going to repeat over and over. In the army, they fall for it every time for the next almost 2 years. So here's what happens. 1 or 2 soldiers, very small amount of people, they would initially attack the camp, maybe killing a couple soldiers. And they would hold a position where they're shooting, or they're firing upon, or they're having people stuck down for a decent amount of time, a couple of hours. And then they would rely on the peasants within that area to tell them when the army was close or close to arriving, because they would be shooting upon a small army installation. That installation would then call the military and say, hey, we're under attack, we need help. And then the army would inevitably come. The 2 soldiers would then run, or they didn't actually physically run. They had a vehicle. They would drive away, and then the other, the larger army, the responding army, would chase them into the mountains. And then the two rebels, they would go to a specific spot where a team of 15 to 20 armed rebels would be hiding, and then they would pull in, and the army would be behind them, and then they would all pop up at once and ambush and massacre the army. And it's very brutal, but it was also ultra effective because they would usually acquire vehicles and a lot of arms and ammunitions, and actually uniforms as well, which they would then utilize. The uniforms might have bullet holes in them, but they would use them nonetheless. And then they would move on to a different spot, and this would repeat over and over for the next 20 months. So this is kind of like that guerrilla warfare tactics that we've kind of been talking about. And the army just didn't know how to respond to it. They just could not figure it out. So this continued all throughout this province I was talking about, Oriente province. And so just a couple months after Batista had basically decided, you know what, we beat Castro, we won this war, we're the best. They were kicking their butts. And to make matters worse, Castro decides to do an interview with a member of the New York Times, a guy by the name of Herbert Matthews, in February of 57. And so this really makes Batista look bad, because the New York Times was circulated in Cuba, even though he tried to stop it from being circulated. And, this reporter from America, this gringo, was able to go down there and find Castro, interview him, talk to him, take pictures with him. And the Cuban military, with all their might and all their power and all their intelligence, was not able to figure out where this guy was. So following this interview, Batista places a bounty of 100,000 pesos on the head of Castro. So here is Herbert Matthews enjoying a cigar along with Fidel. This is another picture that ran in concert with the article. This is actually not from the Matthews interview. This is a later interview that CBS does with Castro. It is not 60 minutes, unfortunately, but it is nonetheless a CBS interview. I've been trying to get a copy of it. I've only found one copy, and it's in a library at University or Kansas State University, and I haven't been able to get it, but maybe someday. And then here's that photo we saw earlier, and this is a picture of the article, and we can see that Castro's still alive and still fighting in the mountains. So, and remember, at this time too, Castro, we have to use kind of our historical relativism here. Castro is not viewed in the same way in America that he is now. There were a lot of people, even just Americans, who didn't have an affiliation with Cuba. There were a lot of Americans who were kind of sympathetic towards this struggle that this Cuban was going through. At this time, there's more and more information coming about how repressive Batista is as an individual and as a leader. And so there were a lot of people that were sympathetic to what Castro was trying to do. And so, obviously this narrative about Castro, especially within the United States, is going to shift pretty quickly in the grand scheme of things. But this was so embarrassing for Batista. And what we're going to find out next is that the intensity to find Castro is really going to ramp up. And the more pressure that Batista places on his state to find Castro, the more effective Castro actually becomes. Because the only thing that Batista really understands is power through force. And the more force that he puts on his people, usually through violations of their rights, the more people end up wanting to join Castro. Okay, because it's just one of those things. So kind of a fascinating example in how a state can fail. So that's where we're going to stop today, but let's see if I can pick my cat up. I'll have a little cat action at the end here. Come here, Evie. Whoa. Hold on, my chair's stuck. This is my cat, Evie. She's my favorite cat. I don't know how long she's going to tolerate this, but this is the cat that I rescued from a wall when I was in college. So I've raised her since she was so small. So she even lets me do things like this. Um, I might lose some influence with her right now, but she loves the under the head now. Oh yeah, life is good. So if you want to respond to this video with a cat of your own, or even a dog, you can, but probably won't be as cute as my cat. So here's Evie. Okay. I was gonna wave, but that didn't happen. Okay. All right, guys. Hope you have a good week. Um, yeah, just another quarantine week. So I'll end it here. Okay.